you're like me, when I think of the last moments of Christ's life, and by moments I don't necessarily mean seconds, but the events that led up to his crucifixion, when I think of that, when I reflect on those moments, the thing that often impresses me most is the physical abuse that Jesus took willingly, unjustly. And you start thinking about that, and it almost moves you, I hope, to, the emotional state of tears, I hope. Because he was beaten, the prophets tell us, to a condition beyond recognition as even human. I don't know how much beating it takes to beat someone to the point that you can't recognize them, but Jesus took that. He took that. And all the ridicule and all the spitting and the crown of thorns and the slanderous remarks, when he had lived a totally innocent, sinless life. Yeah, it's one thing to take abuse when you feel like you had it coming, right? When you deserved it. It's one thing to be treated harshly or to suffer as a result of our own sin or of our own wrongdoing, the consequences of our poor choices. But when you've made every choice right, when you've done nothing wrong, when everything has been according to God's word, God's will, and yet then you face suffering, somehow that makes it even harder, doesn't it? Somehow for us that makes it even more difficult to bear. I've suggested to you before, and I'm going to kind of support that this morning, I hope, with the focus of our study for a few moments, that while the physical abuse that Jesus endured in preparation for and during his time on the cross was beyond description. It's more than we can imagine. And I'm sure it pushed Jesus' physical limits to the very extreme. That's not the real suffering that Jesus endured as he hung on the cross. And even in the moments that led up to the cross. Now I'll explain that, or we'll elaborate on that in a few minutes. But you remember in just a moment's reflection all the way back to the garden. Yeah? When he took the disciples, and of course, there's a lot that I could say about Jesus going to the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm going to try to, something about staying still, I think. There's something about the Garden of Gethsemane that had become so normal for Jesus that Judas knew exactly where to find him. Even though Judas had left the crowd, you remember, in the upper room. Jesus had dismissed him, you remember, and told him, what you need to do, go do now, quickly. Though he had been dismissed in the upper room, and he hadn't been part of the crowd or the entourage that crossed over the flow of blood coming out of Jerusalem from the sacrificing that had already begun of all the lambs on the Passover, into the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus told the disciples to wait here. And then he took those three innermost or most intimate disciples a bit further and asked them to pray with him while he went into the garden to pray. Somehow Judas knew exactly where to find him as he led that mob, as he led the crowd. He knew where he would be. But you remember that it talks about, and again, the gospel writer's description to us, about the prayer that Jesus prayed, the time that he spent in the garden, apart from the disciples, and yet in direct communion with his Father. That prayer was so intense, right, so engaging, that it was as if, the gospel writers tell us, he were sweating drops of blood. That's pretty intense. That's pretty engaged, right? That's pretty all in, you might say. And you think about what it was that he was praying about, and what we're told, at least the portion of it that we read, that we come to know, is that, Father, if there's any other way, then let this cup pass from me. But not my will, yours be done. Now, some people would read that and would suggest that what Jesus was dreading was that he was about to be arrested, that he was about to be hauled before a whole group of people that really made a mockery of justice, even in their attempts at calling it justice, that he was about to be stripped of his clothes and beaten, well, to an unrecognizable condition. And then a crown of thorns that had been platted especially for that purpose, woven together, were rammed onto his head. And he was slapped and beaten and mocked and ridiculed, that Jesus was dreading that physical abuse so much that it was as if he were, well, sweating blood drops in praying to his Father, let this cup pass from me. But because of a question that Jesus asks, and we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 weeks some of the questions that Jesus asked during his earthly ministry, his earthly life. Because of a question that Jesus asked while he's hanging on the cross, I can without confidence tell you that that wasn't what Jesus was praying about. That what hurt him most wasn't the physical abuse. It wasn't the beating. It wasn't the crown of thorns. It wasn't the mockery and the ridicule and all that went along with it. That what hurt him most was expressed in one of the things that he spoke from the cross as he was hanging there. Actually, apparently just moments before, he willingly gave up his spirit and died. And that question was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Have you ever thought about that question? It's easy to read over because, our English rendering of the phrase variously interpreted or depending on which of the gospel writers. But that phrase is easy to read over because of its interpretation to us, and we tend to focus, well, I don't understand the Hebrew, but I do understand the interpretation of it. And sometimes we let that distract us from the point, from the meaning of that question. I mean, was it by Jesus asking, why have you forsaken me, God, that Jesus didn't know the answer to that question? Well, we've already discussed the fact that when Jesus asked a question, whether it was to the disciples or it was to some individual or it was to a crowd of people, that his asking that question wasn't so that he could find out what the answer was. He knew the answer. The point of the question was to cause reflection and to really emphasize the power of the moment, to really put in perspective what people ought to have on their mind. And by Jesus asking the Father, why have you forsaken me, he wasn't asking for information's sake. He was expressing the deepest emotions and concerns and anxieties of his heart. And he said, well, why would he have asked that? Well, he would ask that because you're talking about God hanging on a cross, speaking to God in heaven about something that was so painful, something that was so unusual, something that was so out of norm that it was one of the last things he uttered in excruciating pain as he hung there on the cross. I would assume that everything Jesus said was important. But those things that he as a human, the human part of him said, as he was being or had been nailed to a cross, suspended midair after the brutal beating, and only moments away from physically dying or expiring, that whatever he says, whatever he expresses, man, that's got to be important. For one reason, and it's only the human side of things, it took a lot of effort on his part to say anything from the cross. Didn't it? I mean, can you imagine? Nails through your hands and your feet, and you're hanging midair. and you've been hanging there for quite some time, and you're fighting to get the air into your lungs to begin with, and to use that precious air to not just whisper a question. The text says he screamed it. To exert that kind of energy and effort, that's important. That's an important question that he asks. It's something very much on his mind. It's something very painful to his heart. You know, I think about that question, and one of the first oddities about that question that comes to my mind is this is the same Jesus who replied in answer to his disciples' questions only a few weeks ago. Show us the Father, Jesus, and that'll be enough. We'll believe you then. We'll have faith in you then. That would push us over the top. That would give us full confidence that you are who you are or claim to be, and you've come to do what you claim that you've come to do. And Jesus responds by saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Think about that. How does that statement correlate with or parallel this one, this question? How could the Jesus who said, if you've seen me, you've seen God, you've seen the Father, in a breath only a few weeks later asked the question, my God, why have you forsaken me? God asking God. Isn't that a strange situation? An odd scenario. Now, I'm not going to try to get into describing or understanding even the complexities of Father, Son, and Spirit, and yet one God. Okay? Not going to, my mind's not that big. Not that big. Have to accept the fact by faith. 100% God, 100% man. And yet asking his Father, why have you forsaken me? And you know what? I'm going to ask the same question. Why did God forsake him? And in what sense did God forsake him? Did he cease being God? Was his moments on the cross, his final moments, a time when only the man Jesus was there and God wasn't there anymore? Well, no, I don't believe there's any validity or truth or scriptural support to that conclusion at all. The problem lies in the fact that, well, let's read it again together. Let's read it again together. In Matthew 27, and we could read other gospel accounts, but I just chose Matthew. In Matthew chapter 27, let's begin reading in verse 45. From noon until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. Now, that's an odd time for it to get dark. Yeah? Odd time. In fact, it's about the most odd time that you could imagine. If you were going to pick a time for it to be really strange, for it to get dark, noon to 3 would be about the best you could do. Because that's the time when the sun's straight up almost, and at its brightest, right? Most direct shining. And yet, from noon to 3, darkness came over the whole land. At about 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. And again, we would translate that. We could translate that by saying he screamed at the top of his lungs. My God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those who were standing there heard this, they said, he's calling for Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge, and he filled it with wine vinegar, and he put it on a staff, and he offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. When Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that very moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life, and they came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those who were with him guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." You know, you ask the question, or you consider the question. Jesus asked the question. In what sense was it? What happened on the cross that caused Jesus to turn in an agonizing moment of, physical pain, but emotional, spiritual pain much more so, and scream at the top of his voice, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" What would cause him to ask that question? Well, a little bit of quick history. Many of the Old Testament prophets talk about events where God intervenes in human history in judgment of sin. A bunch of different times, a bunch of different events. And many, if not most, of the Old Testament prophets talk about those events scattered throughout Old Testament history. When one of those prophets, let me not say it that way, very often, when one of those prophets predicts or talks about God judging sin on the earth, do you know one of the terms that he uses? One of the descriptions that he gives? And this was from the mouth of God, so it wasn't just the prophet's own thinking. He describes God's judgment in terms that very often include total darkness. Total darkness. And it's no accident that when Jesus comes, he says, "I am the light of the world." Not darkness. In other words, there's always this contrast in Scripture, from Old Testament all the way through New Testament, from Old Covenant to New Covenant. This contrast between darkness and light, between sin characterized by darkness, by God's judgment characterized by darkness, to righteousness and forgiveness and grace characterized by light. So it ought to ring true, or it ought to be consistent to us as we read this story or this event that leads up to Jesus at 3 o'clock asking, screaming, "Why have you forsaken me?" That question was prefaced by 3 hours of what? Darkness. Absolute darkness. Now, I don't know how God did that. I don't care. I don't mean that to say I'm not interested. It makes no difference. Whether it was an eclipse or God just said, "Let there be no light." Just like he had said, "Let there be light" in Genesis. It makes no difference. God turned the sun off for 3 hours. For 3 hours. As Jesus was hanging on the cross. And that 3 hours of darkness wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. Because, even from a scientific or even from a human perspective, if it were going to be dark for 3 hours, it wouldn't have been from noon to 3. And everybody around, even the skeptical, hard-hearted centurion and his Roman troops that they had execution duty. This wasn't their first. Even they were impressed by what had happened, beginning with 3 hours of darkness. And probably their impression started before the darkness, but the darkness and the earthquake and all that stuff convinced them that something miraculous, extraordinary had happened here. And there were a lot of miracles, by the way. Darkness wasn't the only one. But it was the one, I'm going to suggest to you, that led up to Jesus asking the question that he asked. Because darkness for 3 hours was God's judgment of sin. And who was the one who had been appointed by God, and who had been submitted to by God as the bearer of sin, the one on whom God's judgment was being poured. Well, let me pause there before you answer that question and tell you where it should have been poured was on you and on me. That's where it should have been poured. It should have been poured on every living human being since Adam. That's where the judgment of God against sin should have been poured. But where it was poured was on Jesus. The only person who ever lived a sinless life. Isn't that amazing? The only person who didn't deserve God's judgment got the full force of God's judgment. Got the full brunt of it. Got enough of it that it was sufficient to be the punishment that every human being deserved. Now, I don't know how you measure or describe punishment or judgment from God. I don't know what measure you use, whether it's pounds or gallons or years. I don't know. I don't know. But I can tell you that what was poured on Jesus that day, that moment in time, was heavy enough, big enough, dark enough, painful enough, especially to someone who was the only someone ever that didn't deserve it, that it caused him to scream out. It caused him to scream out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And of course, he knows the answer to that. He had already submitted to knowing the answer to that. The Hebrew writer says it was for the joy that he endured the cross. What joy? It doesn't look like joy to me, right? It doesn't look like joy at this point. Well, it was the joy of knowing that if he bore the sin, if he bore the guilt, if he bore the judgment, you and I wouldn't have to. That was the joy. That was the joy. Folks, there's a lot of ways to think about the gospel, the good news. There's a lot of perspectives to bring to that event, to that truth. But to me, for me personally, and maybe it's just, for me, this is the one that strikes, I think, the deepest. I hate to think that Jesus stood there with his back bared to that Roman soldier and had the skin literally beaten off his back and the flesh torn from his ribs. I hate to think of that picture. Watched a movie, and probably a lot of you did too, that depicted some parts of that. And I can remember even the movie that was designed to represent it was so sickening that I couldn't watch it. I remember. And my wife will tell you, we looked at each other and I said, please don't hit him again. Please don't hit him again, But as bad as that was, he never turned to the soldier and said, please don't hit me anymore. He never turned to the soldiers that were spitting on him, you see, he never responded to that. He never reacted to that. And the reason he didn't wasn't because it wasn't painful. It was because what's painful is far more painful than that, far worse than that. The judgment of God, of the Father against the Son, was poured on Jesus' back that day, that time, at 3 o'clock that afternoon, after 3 hours of God's darkness judgment on the heinous result and consequences of sin, lavished or poured on the only one who didn't deserve it, and he took it. And you remember, he had just told the disciples whenever Peter pulled out his sword and took a wild swing, you remember? we talk about, in fact, we sing a song about this. He could have called 10,000 angels. He could have called more than 10,000 angels. And he wouldn't have had to call at all. He could have just thought it, right? Just thought it. I've told you before, and it's kind of it's not comical in any sense, but it's kind of a weak human mind in its curiosities, I guess. But I've always pictured, or have for many years pictured, the angels looking down on that scene and all that led up to that scene. They kept looking back and forth. Kept looking back and forth from father to son. What's going on here? How can this be? Do you see what they're doing to him? You see how they're treating him? I have to believe that Gabriel and Michael, and there probably are others who were the commanders among the angels, were just waiting for permission. Yeah? Just waiting for the nod. Now, they would have been quick to rush to Jesus' side, I guarantee it. I don't know any more about the workings of heaven than you do. But I believe that with all my heart. And Jesus said that. Put your sword up. I'm not resisting what's happening. I'm not fighting against it. I'm submitting to it. Should I not drink the cup that my Father's given me? What cup is that? The cup of his wrath. Should I not drink the cup of my Father's wrath? Because it was to this very purpose that I came to this hour. That's why I'm here. I came to be separated from my Father, to be forsaken by my Father. Why did his Father forsake him? Because his Father is too pure, the wisdom writer says, to look on sin. That's why. That's why. Jesus became sin for us. Now, he didn't commit sin. He became sin. He took it. He carried it. He bore the brunt of it. He suffered the consequence of it. And it was painful enough that he turned in agony to his Father and he said, "Why have you forsaken me?" And he knew all the time why. But because it was so overpowering, he had to ask. And I'm glad he did, because it reminds me of what happened that day, see? It reminds me of how powerful that cross and his volunteering to be there is for me. Because I would never have had the right to ask, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because I know the answer too. I've been forsaken by God, if I've been forsaken by God, because of my sinfulness, because of my guilt, because God's too pure to fellowship sin. I know the answer. That wasn't the answer for Jesus. Wasn't the answer. The answer was, because you bear the sins of the world. I told you, I remember a lot of things I don't remember, but I remember vividly laying on my bed at night. And I'm one of those people that just because I go to bed doesn't mean I'm going to sleep anytime soon. I think about a lot of stuff before I ever fall off to sleep. Most of it totally useless, but I do anyway. I can't quite conquer that deal. But I remember more than one night in the earlier years of my life laying on my bed in preparation for going to sleep, the lights off, and thinking about something that I was ashamed of. Let's just leave it that way. Some sin I'd committed, something I'd done, some lie I'd told, some deception that I thought I'd pulled, something whatever. And laid there thinking about how ashamed I was of that now. And how I hoped that it would never be discovered. That I could keep it hidden, that nobody would ever know. And I remember feeling I'm not going to tell that whole story. I'll just tell you that there are times in my teenage years, or early teenage years, there are times when having my father pull off his belt, as physically uncomfortable as it was a relief. Because there was something about, if I can take the punishment for it, then I don't have to feel the guilt for it anymore. right? I don't have to carry that weight around wondering who's going to know and when he's going to find out and what it's going to be like. And there was some relief, as odd as that sounds. And you know what I'm talking about. There's some relief. And my point is simply that carrying around guilt is a pretty heavy burden, isn't it? It's a lot heavier than we acknowledge. Walking around knowing, and just waiting for the hammer to fall, right? Waiting for it to be revealed. Well, if that's heavy for you and me, imagine what it would be like to carry everybody's for all time, forever. I mean, every wrong, every sin, ever. Imagine what that would be like. I think screaming out would be a very small thing compared to what that would feel like. You see, when Jesus turned and asked the question, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" what he was voicing was the fact that what's really happening here on the cross isn't physical at all. It's spiritual. The conflict and the fight between right and wrong is being fought on a level and to a scale that we have a hard time even wrapping our mind around. And it was enough of a battle that God the Father had to turn his back on God the Son until the price was paid. It's enough. And he did that for us. He did that for me. He did it for you. Isaiah talks about it in Isaiah 53. Let me just read one little short passage out of that just to tell you that God had been planning for this for a long time. Long before Jesus was born in the manger. This was already on the mind and heart of God. Surely he took our pain, and he bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds, we've been healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. And yet the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. Wow. Wow. That's a story too good not to tell. You hear me? That's a truth too good not to share. You want to talk about the gospel? Good news doesn't do it justice. It's better than that. It's too good to be true. It's unbelievably true and good. I want you to think about, I'm not trying to be emotional. I don't think a purely emotional reaction or response is the depth to which our commitment to God ought to be. I'm not saying it shouldn't be emotional. I'm just saying that shouldn't be the basis or foundation. But I want you to think about, we're going to stand up and sing the song that Johnny picked out for us to sing here in just a minute, of invitation and encouragement. And encouragement is for us to think about what that means for us. And invitation is for if I'm not living a life that glorifies and honors that, focuses on that, points toward that all the time. Oh, we're sinners. We're still strugglers. We're all that. But you know what we mean. You know what it means to live in honor of something, right? You know what it means to make that the priority of our life. I want to ask you if that's true. Is Jesus screaming out to his Father, "Why have you forsaken me?" A reflection of how serious I'm taking my relationship that sacrifice makes possible. Because that's the only way I could be right with God, was if he took God turning his back on him. It's the only way I could be right with God. And he did. He did. If you're here this morning and not in a right relationship with God, it's not because Jesus didn't bear the price. It's not because Jesus didn't suffer the consequence. It's because you simply haven't been willing to this point to accept the terms and conditions that being forgiven and adopted and indwelt by the Spirit of God makes possible for us. God makes the offer. Jesus has paid the price. It's a matter of us being willing to accept by faith the relationship and the conditions and living in honor, becoming a living sacrifice. In view of his sacrifice, asking me to be a living sacrifice is a pretty small thing, actually, right? Pretty small thing. We can help you this morning either to become a child of God, to accept that blood being applied to your sins and that price being paid and you being credited with his righteousness. If you haven't done that, why? Why? Explain that, please, to yourself at least. To yourself at least. And if you have, how much of our life is focused on that? If we can help you this morning in any way, give us the opportunity, please, to do that while we stand and sing together.